In his notebooks, Leonardo da Vinci writes, "Now do you not see that the eye embraces the beauty of the whole world? It is the lord of astronomy and the maker of cosmography. It counsels and corrects all the arts of humanity. It moves men to the different parts of the world. It is the prince of mathematics. Its sciences are certain. It has measured the heights and sizes of the stars. It's found the elements and their locations. Has generated architecture, perspective, and the divine art of painting. O most excellent thing, above all others created, what peoples, what tongues shall be those that can fully describe your true operation? This is the window of the human body through which it mirrors its way and brings to fruition the beauty of the world, by which the soul is content to stay in its human prison." This remark, I think, is particularly appropriate for opening any discussion of Leonardo da Vinci because of the primacy he places upon vision and sight in his own work. Leonardo is really unlike virtually any other artist that we certainly see in the Renaissance, certainly unlike anyone that came before, and I think that few ever since have really matched the wide range of his interests, the technical virtuosity of his work, and the sense of an inquisitive and curious mind that is seeking always, pretty much throughout his life, 1452 to 1519, seeking the causes of natural phenomena. Most people, I think, understand Leonardo in the context of his inventions, especially the idea of his inventions or the notion that he had a kind of almost supernatural, paranormal insight into the world. The sort of mysterious and romantic vision of Leonardo, I think, is not as interesting ultimately as a Leonardo closer to his own time and his sort of fitting into his own history. I think to better understand that in the context of art, it's a good idea to take a quick look at where art stood in the decades preceding his birth, again, 1452. A good example of this might be the work of the painter known as Masaccio in Florence in the middle or so of the third decade of the 15th century. For instance, in his striking fresco, The Tribute Money, Masaccio creates a coherent and emotionally expressive environment using the tools of representation that were newly available to him in the beginning decades of the 15th century. Chief among these would be as seen on the building on the right, the tool of linear perspective to mathematically calculate distances and develop a sense of space, a pretty good representation of the powers of light, especially as seen in the cast shadows of the figures of Christ and his disciples in the center, a very clear sense of atmospheric perspective, rendering of the effects of intervening atmosphere on geographical features at a far distance as seen in the mountains in the upper left of the fresco, and of course in the rendering of the subjects themselves, particularly the tax collector in the short tunic, represented in front and back in an attitude of contrapposto. A similar approach is seen in the work of Piero della Francesca in his Flagellation, dating from several decades after the Masaccio. Here, the intense preoccupation with perspective has reached a kind of ultimate culmination. Its mathematical clarity and absolute certainty, I think, is made manifest especially in the building and interior to the left, where Christ is affixed to a column and is being whipped by two figures who are almost similar to Masaccio's front and back figures, but have a certain frozen and abstract air, something that I think most of the figures in this scene have in common. Basically, the setting is divorced ultimately from nature. It has no real connection ultimately with the natural world, and it's changing and ever variable phenomena, something that Leonardo will take up in earnest. An alternative view of art is seen in the work of Sandro Botticelli in his learned and esoteric allegory known as Primavera. Here, a poetic and relatively elite type of painting is being produced for the Medici court, one that is laden with, again, esoteric and perhaps Platonic deeper meanings, something that would not have been accessible, I think, to the average viewer, certainly in the 1480s when it's painted, and hardly more so today, in fact. The vision of art that it represents is very different, I think, from Pier della Francesca or Masaccio, in that the interest in the natural world in a kind of empirical sense, as Masaccio represents it, or the focus on a precise mathematical calculation, as Piero represents it, is for the most part missing altogether. A good example in terms of contrast would be Leonardo's Last Supper from the late 1490s in Milan. In this image, which is a very complicated fresco, not least because of its unorthodox actual painting technique, Leonardo was trying to, in essence, adopt oil paint for use on a plaster wall, and this explains in large part its ruinous condition today. In this fresco, we see the reaction of Christ's disciples to the announcement by Christ that one of them will betray him. And Leonardo really explores the possibilities of vision in just about every aspect of the picture, from the psychological reactions of the disciples, the uncanny atmosphere that fills the room and creates more than just a mathematical rendition of space. In its own time, more or less, Vasari commented on the sheer veracity of the linen tablecloths and the implements and food and what have you on it. The sense was that Leonardo was trying to capture not merely a kind of mathematical construction or a relatively simplistic rendering of light falling on objects in space, but a coherent and cohesive sort of envelope, if you will, in which these actors play out this all-important Christian drama. Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated with the processes of nature from a very early age, as this landscape painting dating from 1473 indicates. Throughout the drawing, which is done when the artist is about 21 years old and dated to the year 1473, we see a preoccupation with the falling water, the sense of movement that's present in this image. It's really quite striking compared to the relatively static and conventional representations of landscape in his own time. Whether on the macro scale, as in this landscape, or on the micro scale, as in this beautiful drawing of a plant, I think the Star of Jerusalem is the name of the plant, Leonardo is fascinated with the possibilities of movement and a kind of mode of drawing that takes into account the possibilities for dynamic growth and process and change. This is something, again, that's very much, I won't say at odds, but certainly very advanced compared to representations of nature in Leonardo's own time. Leonardo was fascinated, and his notebooks make this abundantly clear, fascinated with the ways in which natural forms are developed, the processes they allow. And this is present both in the biological and the geological realm. An example of this is very readily seen in his endless studies of water and the behavior of water. And this represents, in a sense, the kind of intersection of the organic and inorganic. Like no other artist before, and really hardly since, Leonardo takes the trouble to, as in this remarkable drawing, takes the trouble to try to reproduce on an infinitesimally detailed scale the behavior of water as it enters into a basin, following the paths of each individual current, the bubbles boiling up to the surface, the eddies and whirlpools, all of these, in essence, changing and shaping the world in which he lived, and certainly that we live in as well. His paintings, finished paintings, are relatively rare and present a number of obstacles for their understanding and interpretation. One of the most famous of these is a painting from the early 1480s, the Madonna the Rocks, where Leonardo, for the first time, really in the history of Western art, again drawing upon its predecessors to some degree, such as Masaccio or even perhaps Giotto, going back to the 14th century, creates this entirely plausible and coherent setting for the four figures that we see in the painting. Most fascinating, ultimately, perhaps beyond the theological dimensions of the picture, I think for Leonardo personally, is this remarkable setting, this cavernous interior opening out onto a distant vista with numerous, really ultimately uncountable peaks of rock and again caverns. If we look a little bit deeper into this detail shows us a natural environment that is full of change and reflects, I think, and records the effects of time and the environment on it. Leonardo, when he, for instance, depicts the rock peaks that are in the far distant left, gives us a sense of almost infinite distance between the foreground figures and that background, suggesting, again, through the use of atmospheric perspective, a far more complex and ultimately mysterious environment, certainly than, say, Masaccio's rendition. And in the foreground, the sense of organic growth and life is represented with that pool of water in again, the very base, and those marvelously rendered plants in the lower left foreground, again, very similar to that drawing that we saw earlier. Perhaps just as important is Leonardo's mastery of the play of light upon the figures and that sort of infinitely subtle gradation between light and dark that's such an important part of his work, that quality that is described very often as sfumato, S-F-U-M-A-T-O. Leonardo's interest in nature extended also to the study of human proportions, as in his very famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man. Leonardo's looking for these underlying principles, these codes, if you will, in the genuine sense of the term, numerical formulae or equations that might give some insight into the structures of nature and their function. This is complemented by an extraordinary series of human dissections, human anatomy under study, as in this examination of the shoulder structure of an elderly man. These types of investigations are really far, far ahead of their time, not least for their detail, but even more so for that unceasing attempt to understand the underlying function that gives rise to their shape. Is Leonardo studying evolution in a sense? Don't think that's necessarily the case, but he's certainly looking for, in a sense, first causes as to why things appear and act the way they do. This even extends to the human embryo or fetus, is in this extraordinary representation of the fetus in the womb. Very, very remarkable. We certainly don't have time to go into the kind of depth, I think, that would properly reflect this drawing, but suffice to say that, among other things, it gives us an insight not just into human anatomy, but also into the artistic processes that might best capture such a difficult and elusive subject. Leonardo's fascination with nature leads him to especially develop the idea of drawing, and drawing is a critically important tool for Leonardo in developing the sense of the structure and function of nature and the behavior of light. His very famous Virgin and St. Anne cartoon, now in the National Gallery of London, highlights his fascination with shadow especially, and the blending in of forms into one another, creating a much more, again, dynamic and viewing experience much more reflective of our own reality. Again, that theme constant in his work of figures immersed in an almost cosmic natural setting is seen, for instance, in this famous Virgin Child of St. Anne today in the Louvre in Paris, where a vast and really almost infinite extent of mountains is carved and developed by water, as you can see in the upper left. Here's a detail showing that process at work. The sense of a cosmic kind of interaction between water and stone is at the heart of much of Leonardo's landscape paintings from the very, very beginning, as seen in that 1473 drawing. Perhaps this is most spectacularly expressed in Leonardo's most famous painting, one of the most famous in all of Western history, the Mona Lisa, where the Mona Lisa, the subject of the painting, sits in front of this extraordinary, almost lunar landscape with winding rivers and distant peaks. Her expression is ambiguous and leads us to wonder what her psychological state is, a similar kind of mystery reflected ultimately in those landscapes behind.